All right. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here today in this event, Tech Day Pakistan. I really love to be part of all the events in where we can spread the word about Azure SQL. And today we will be talking about one of the components of Azure SQL, which is Managed Instance. So the name for this presentation is the evolution of SQL Server as a Service, Azure SQL Managed Instance. A little bit about myself. My name is Javier Villegas. Like Gonzalo before, I am from Buenos Aires, Argentina. I work at Mediterranean Shipping Company as IT director in the DBA BI Services. I've been working with SQL Server for more than 25 years. I am Microsoft MVP in the data platform category since 2016, and I am also Microsoft certified trainer. Additionally, I am a member of the Azure Data Tech Community Board of Advisors. I also define myself as a technical speaker. As I said before, I try to go cover every single event in where I get an invitation to present and spread the word. I'm also, same as Gonzalo, member of our local SQL Argentina community, in where we have our monthly events, and again, looking forward to start having sessions in person, hopefully at some point in the short future. On the left side of the screen, you see my contact information, email address, Twitter handle, LinkedIn, and my blog. In case you want to connect with me, if you have any questions about the presentation, or you just want to, get connected. All right. Well, some housekeeping, information. I believe that everybody been in previous sessions today. So I guess if there are questions or these kind of things, you know how to ask them through this Teams platform. So let's start. A few years ago, Microsoft came with this new, let's say, umbrella called Azure SQL. Why do I say umbrella? Well, basically, this is a group of products and services that Microsoft branded Azure SQL. Initially, there were 3 components, and recently, Microsoft added a 4th component. Which are all those 4 components? Well, first of all, Microsoft gave us SQL Server, the same that we've been using for decades, right? In running in Azure SQL machines, right? So this is an option in where we have the same SQL Server 2012, 2016, 2019, running on any platform of choice. You know that since SQL Server 2017, we have the possibility of running SQL Server in major Linux platform like SUSE, Ubuntu, or Red Hat. And we have the possibility of easily, quickly define and deploy one of these virtual machines, right? This is the first component, which is Azure SQL Virtual Machines. Then there are 2 components, which are Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance, the one that we're going to be talking today, right? These are SQL Server endpoints that Microsoft provide to us. So we just connect to SQL, and that's it. We don't care what is the infrastructure behind the scene, what is the infrastructure supporting, right, these Azure services. So that is why Microsoft called this platform as a service, right? We just connect through Management Studio, but we don't take care about what is behind, right? We don't need to apply patches. We don't need to do a bunch of things that we're going to be go through this through the presentation, right? Those are platform as a service. Finally, and recently, Microsoft added a fourth component to the Azure SQL family, which is Azure SQL Edge Edition. What is this component? Well, basically, we have the possibility of running SQL Server on an ARM device, right? Like, for example, one like this. This is a Raspberry Pi, right? We can have SQL Server running here. It's the same SQL Server that we know. Of course, we won't have here our mission critical decision maker solution, right? But for several scenarios at edge, right, you collect information from sensors, data, real-time data, etc. This is a great solution. So this is the fourth component of the Azure SQL family, right? So this was a brief overview of the Azure SQL family. So today we're going to talk about one in particular, which is Azure SQL Managed Instance. So a little bit about the agenda. We're going to have a short introduction. We will see the difference about infrastructure as a service, platform as a service. We will mention briefly about Azure SQL DB, the other component, and then we will go deeply through Managed Instance. Then we will see how we can do certain migrations from SQL Server On-Premise to Managed Instance. And as a last point, we will cover which are the updates coming in Managed Instance, and what is the roadmap, what does Microsoft have in mind for this popular service, right? So first of all, we know that for years we've been running our services on-premise, right? On-premise means in our bare metal servers, in our virtual machines, in our own data center, right? So then we get this point in where we would like to start moving our workload to the cloud, right? That was the premise. Start moving your workload to the cloud. So we know that dealing with data center, with infrastructure, with contracts, with hardware vendors, etc., is a complex activity and it's hard to manage and is in some time quite costly, right? So if we want to pass most of these points to a vendor, in this case, Microsoft Azure, right? We can do that easily and focus on our business. Focus in this case in just handling and managing databases, not managing all the things that we have behind the scene, right? So we got into this point and we say, hey, good. Now, my company, we took the decision to move everything to Azure. So what do we have available? Because we can say, let's go to the cloud. From where do we start, right? So let's say is that if today you still need to have control over your infrastructure, meaning your operating system, the network, the authentication, etc., right? We have this, Microsoft provides us this option. As I said at the beginning, those are the virtual machines running SQL Server, right? In where we deploy them, but then we have to take care of mostly everything. Right? Microsoft is doing a good job of trying to take some responsibilities in the infrastructure for this Azure SQL VM, but at the end of the day, we are the ones who are responsible of handling all this, right? For those cases, if we still need to take care of this, infrastructure as a service is the solution, right? But on the other hand, if we want to, as I said, focus our effort in the database and try to forget about what is behind the scenes, right? Microsoft provides these two solutions, Azure SQL Database and Managed Instance, in where the only thing we will see, right, is the SQL Server endpoint, right? It's like, having our database is running in autopilot mode. So, quick summary of these three components. Each of them has its own strengths. We, let's say, have to, depending on our use case, we need to choose one of these three main options. We cannot run everything on any of these three solutions. There are some specific cases, right? Let's say, I like to say that when we want to, let's say, just start having our workload in Azure, the best option in terms of doing it quickly is to have these VMs running SQL servers, because we will see that we can have, since the SQL Server 2008 R2 up to a SQL Server 2019, and within those we can have all the combinations that we can imagine, right? So if we have a SQL 2012 running on-prem in our server, the easiest and quickest way to move all that to Azure is basically having that VM in Azure, right? And just, start the migration process. Then we can start thinking on modernizing our existing applications, right? By either migrating our legacy application already running in Azure virtual machine to a managed instance, or eventually, if we are starting a brand new deployment, let's say that our management came up with a new project, right? That, as part of this project, one of the necessary components will be relational database. Well, in that case, if we start from scratch, it's better to focus on Azure SQL Database. Why I say that? Well, it's mainly target for new and modern application, because the main concept is a little bit different than what we've been doing so far till now, right? In SQL Server or in Managed Instance, we can have multiple applications running on the same SQL Server instance, right? Managed Instance or the SQL Server itself, right? And again, if our application maybe is a little bit legacy, in where we have processes like, I don't know, a report which rely on a store procedure, and that store procedure is doing joins between tables that are located within different user databases, right? We can do that quickly and very well with SQL Server or Managed Instance, right? As we've been doing, as I said, forever. But in Azure SQL DB, it's not possible, because everything for our application has to live within the same user database, right? That's the first main difference between Azure SQL Database and maybe the other components.
We have a question here.
Yes.
So does Azure SQL Managed Instance include SQL Server component, including firewall? So yeah, that's the question.
We just gonna start our deep insight into Managed Instance. You will see in few minutes everything that Managed Instance has and covered, and maybe what is the main difference with SQL Server, right? Which is gonna be the main comparison. And you will also see the parts that are missing, right? Which are not too many, but there are. So wait a few minutes.
I think probably the user is trying to sort of find similarities, even though they have already migrated to Azure, managed service, SQL managed services.
I have a very detailed slide about that comparison. So just give me a few minutes and
Sure.
You will see the answer in the screen. So let's say that these are the main, let's say, bullet points about Azure SQL DB, Managed Instance, and a VM running into in SQL Server, right? Each of them has their own particular things, especially if we focus on high availability and disaster recovery, especially on high availability. Well, Gonzalo, his presentation before was focusing on high availability on managed instance. I can say that on a SQL Server virtual machine, if we want to achieve high availability, we need to do it manually ourselves, meaning we have to deploy the cluster, the Active Directory, the availability group, ship the databases, and manage and administer the whole solution. In Azure SQL DB or managed instance is way easier because high availability is a concept that we have on the service from day one, right? When we deploy a managed instance or an Azure SQL database, right, it is highly available out of the box, let's say. So this is quite important to have some of the differences between our existing SQL Server, again, the one that we've been using since years, and these new modern services. So first of all, as I just mentioned before, we have the possibility of achieving business continuity with high availability out of the box, right? So when we deploy a managed instance or an Azure SQL DB also, we have, depending on how we do it, we have starting from 3 nines of SLA when we do this deployment, right? Managed instance has like 3 components that are constantly replicating behind the scenes. We don't see it, we don't manage it, and actually we don't care what is, right? But again, Microsoft give us as part of the service, have availability included, right? We also have the possibility of relying on the automated backups, right? That means that we can easily set up the possibility of Microsoft as part of managed instances taking the backups for us. And not only taking the backups, also configuring the retention, right, for certain amount of time, as well as the sheer replication for those, right? We can take the backups, right, and we can automatically store it into multiple Azure regions for redundancy purposes, right? So let's say that Microsoft has a major problem with one of their regions, right? We have our backups stored into multiple regions. That's the first thing. But there is also sheer replication for the whole managed instance. That means that we can have, same as an availability group, well, we can have a managed instance in a different Azure region, just replicating behind the thing. And, in case of a major disaster, again, we don't have problems, right? Scalability, not only in managed instance, but also in virtual machines. Scaling in Azure, not only in these services, but in most of the Azure services, right, is a matter of few clicks. Let's say that today we have this application, this database running on-premise on our SQL Server in our company, and let's say that we need to scale the environment because it's running out of horsepower. Maybe we have to put additional memory, more CPU, faster disks, or anything. We know that it's not an easy process. We need to, first of all, check with the hardware vendor if it is possible doing it on this server. Then we have to start the process of buying those components, and then finally we have to, coordinate a downtime just to do these changes, right? In Azure, just adding more CPU, more memory, putting additional disk, faster disk, everything we want, right? It's a matter of few clicks, and within few minutes we can have our virtual machines, our managed instance, or our Azure SQL databases scale up or down. And we can also set up certain mechanisms to do the scaling dynamically, meaning on a certain part of the week or the month, we know that we're going to have a peak activity, right, because of our business, right? So automatically we can scale up, right? And then when we are not using those resources, we can scale down, right? So this is quite interesting. Something that I like to also highlight in terms of Azure SQL is like, unlike SQL Server, which has a version, right? In my case, I started working with SQL Server 6.0 many years ago, but there are several major versions since then until today. Today we have SQL Server 2019, and Microsoft announced SQL Server 2022, right? And every time we need to do a migration, we need to validate all these new versions, etc., right? Azure SQL Managed Instance is versionless, same as Azure SQL Database. What is versionless? Well, as the name say, there is no version, right? So we know that is Azure SQL, period. And Microsoft took the commitment of having it at versionless. It's not going to change any version in the future. Does it mean that this is a static version of SQL Server and never is going to change? Absolutely not, right? Actually, it's the other way around. Microsoft is giving us new features first in Managed Instance and Azure SQL Database, and when they are proven, they move it in a new cumulative update or in the next SQL Server version on the SQL product, right? But this is what Microsoft call versionless. We, let's say, don't have to worry about versions. That is a great thing. And then we have all the power of SQL Server, right? We have, all the knowledge that we have on T-SQL, of the knowledge that we've been dealing in terms of administering a SQL Server environment is the same, right? We will go through that in a minute, but, all the features related to, for example, performance, right? They are all in there, right? And we can take the same advantage of that we've been doing it for years in SQL Server. So what is a managed instance, right? Well, managed instance is basically a service, right, which is giving us the power of running a SQL Server endpoint, and is almost 100% compatible with the SQL Server that we all use and love, right? It gives us all the benefit of virtual network connectivity, security, firewall rules, and as a good thing, as a part of these services, Microsoft provides us high availability, automatic patching, right, of the platform, meaning that we don't know when and how, but they are keeping the environment up to date, right? They are taking the backups, right? And with all of that, it reduces a lot how we handle our costs and our total cost of ownership, right? So imagine putting your SQL Server databases running in an autopilot in a managed instance in where the service take care of high availability, applying the patches, taking the backups, right? That's definitely a lot, right? So with all this, now, right, all the tasks that we've been doing, we rely on Microsoft Azure. We don't need to worry about hardware vendors, handling data centers, high availability, disaster recovery, update, monitoring, and, because as I said, it's part of the service. So at some point, I mentioned that it's almost 100% like the SQL Server that we all use and love, right? Let's see a little bit what that means. First of all, if we would like to do a migration from our SQL Server databases to a managed instance, we have multiple tools which help us with that. But let's say if we want to do it let's say the way that we've been doing it forever, it is possible, which is taking a backup of the source database in our SQL Server on-prem and restoring that database in managed instance. So we take a backup and we restore it. Done. We have our database running in managed instance, right? As for today, this is a one-way process, meaning that if we take the backup from our SQL Server 2019, right, and we restore it to a managed instance, right, we cannot take a backup from the managed instance and restore it back to SQL Server on-premise. That may change in the short future, but that is the possibility right now. But no, backup restores. We all, as a DBA, we've been doing this since, I believe, the first day we start working with this, right? There are also other techniques, right, to do migration. Like, for example, another one that we normally use, which is log shipping. We can involve a managed instance as part of log shipping, right? In terms of programmability, well, all the tools that we've been using that are available in managed instance. If we would like to use, temporary tables, if we have, as I said before, multiple databases and we need one store procedure to access tables located in multiple user databases, that's not the problem. Eventually, if we need to configure a link server to an external SQL Server or another managed instance, we can do it easily, right? And we also have the CLR modules. In terms of security, SQL Server is the platform with less amount of security-related problems since the last 9 years, right? And SQL Server is, historically has been with a bunch of techniques to accomplish security. There are several features like transparent data encryption, row-level security, always encrypted, and the possibility of doing SQL auditing in our instance. All that, it's also available in managed instance. For us, for the DBAs, right, dynamic management views and functions and extended events, we can do it on a managed instance. Features like query store, automatic query tuning, also available in all these, managed instance scenarios. If we use SQL Server Agent, and within SQL Server Agent also we use database mail, we have that in managed instance. Why do I focus on this, right? Because some of these features are not available in Azure SQL Database, like, for example, SQL Server Agent, right? And finally, there are other scenarios like, for example, Service Broker, Change Data Capture, Transactional Replication, right, which is also available in managed instance. And most probably the best part of this is that if today we have our SQL Server running SQL Server 2005, right? Hopefully nobody is using 2005 these days because, as you know, it's not longer supported. Also 2008 is not supported, right? But eventually, if we have our 2005 databases, meaning compatibility level 90, we can take a backup of those databases, right? And restore it to a managed instance, keeping compatibility level 90, right? Really, bunch of possibilities to do migration. And as I said, quite easily, and we will see it in action in a second. Oh, okay. We are ready to start working with managed instance. So how do we start with, right? How do we decide what to do within managed instance. Okay, first of all, Microsoft provides us what they call service tier, right? There are two service tiers. One is general purpose, and the other one is business critical. Microsoft tells us that most of the workload runs fine under general purpose service tiers. But if our, let's say, workload requires very, very low latency in the disk, faster recovery, and additional readable secondary to offload the read-only workload, well, business critical will be the option. Both of those models relies on the vCore model, right? Meaning that we will choose the amount of virtual cores that our managed instance will have, right? And the main difference to accomplish lower latency in business critical than in general purpose is the storage. In general purpose, the storage is remote, and in business critical, the storage is a combination of local and remote and external replicas. Here we have point in where we have, for example, the differences between general purpose and business critical in terms of, for example, if you see I/O latency in general purpose, we have a latency of between 5 and 10 milliseconds, while in business critical, we have between 1 and 2 milliseconds. Business critical, as you can imagine, is more expensive than general purpose. And see the third line in terms of availability, SLA, right? Both of them provide us 4 nines of SLA, right? Quite interesting. So how do we start, let's say, the migration process if we want to, right? Well, Microsoft gives us a set of tools and services that help us with what they call assessment of our existing SQL databases to then migrate to Azure. There is one application database migration assistant that we're going to connect to our SQL Server databases on-premise, and we will have the possibility of choosing which is going to be the destination. If it is going to be a SQL Server running on a virtual machine, a managed instance, or an Azure SQL database, right? Depending on the destination, we will have a different type of assessment, and this assessment will provide a report, which is basically going to tell us if there is something that we need to adjust at the source to be able to move it to one of these options. Remember what I said earlier, right? That Azure SQL database, the main difference is that everything has to live within the same user database, right? So if in our source there are things that are, accessing or using more than one database, well, it's going to come up in this report. And the interesting thing is that, well, Microsoft is not going to fix it for us, but it will detect the objects in where we may have this problem. It will tell us the object name, right? And it will provide us with the documentation for us to fix it, right? We will have a lot of links to do the fix ourselves. After all this is fixed, if we want to still go to an Azure SQL database, it will create what they call the backpack and will ship it to a managed instance, right? Sorry, to an Azure SQL database. So these are the tools and services that Microsoft provided. This software that we can just go to the Microsoft website and download it right now for free. Database data migration assistant, right? And the Azure SQL, the Azure database migration service that will help us with the migration process itself.
I have a question.
Yes.
So there was a slide that you had posted where you are showing the comparison of replication, right? I think there was.
Say again, sorry?
You were showing some sort of comparison of replication on yeah, this one, the business critical one.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So I mean, if like is what would be like a use case if you could sort of highlight for the there is an I/O latency of 1 to 2 milliseconds, and then there's like 5 to 10 milliseconds. What would be a good use case where you could sort of share,
It's not only latency, it's also IOPS, right? Um, so this slide is maybe a little bit old. Microsoft has adjusted this a little bit up, right? But the pattern is still the same. General purpose is more specific for, let's say, as Microsoft said, most of the workload, right? There are certain workloads that will require lower latency, right? Business critical workload, like, for example, a highly transactional environment that is constantly doing insert updates, delete, right, in a high rate. And, consider other things that I mentioned about business critical is that it's not only the latency, is that it's provide us by default an additional replica in where we can just do all our read-only workload, let's say for reporting or BI purposes, right? So that's gonna depend.
Maybe like specific industries like where there's like high availability of streaming data, I guess, like certain places, maybe healthcare or where healthcare scenario.
Yeah, I mean, in my case, let me tell you, I use a mix of general purpose and business critical, depending on the criticity of the application, right? Not because of availability, but in terms of uh, resources. Consider this, that if you start your application or you move to a general purpose tier, right, you will have through the Azure portal all the possibility of monitoring how you're using those resources, if the latency that you have is enough or not, right? And eventually, if you need, remember what I said about the scalability, you can move from general purpose to business critical within a couple of clicks, right? So what I will recommend is that you can start with a general purpose, do your evaluation, because every application or every industry, let's say, may have their own usage pattern, right? So there is no like a recipe to use one or the other, right? My recommendation is maybe we start with the general purpose and then doing the proper monitoring on how we use the resources, right? We can move up to business critical quite easily. Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Okay, so for managed instance, how do we migrate from a SQL Server on-premise or SQL Server running on a Azure VM, right? First of all, we need to, let's say, move or manually move everything that is related to the system options, meaning logins, SQL shops, alerts, certificate, etc., like on a regular migration, right? But then when there is the moment to move the data itself, the user databases, what we need to do is just take a backup. You know that since SQL Server 2012, you can do directly a backup to an storage account, right? Directly from SQL Server, backup to URL, right? Or you can just do the backup to your local drives and then copy the files to the same storage account. And then it's as simple as from the managed instance, point to that storage account and restore your database. With that, you have your user database that was on the source, restore it up and running in a managed instance. For cases in where you may have, let's say, a big database, right? You may have other options like manage backup to do continuous restore, and this way you can accomplish your migration easily. Something that I like to highlight is that when we get the SQL Server installation media, we have also within the same media analysis services, integration services, and we used to have reporting services. Now we have a link to go and download the latest reporting services component. Well, managed instance is only the SQL engine, right? It's not analysis services, integration services, and reporting services. So consider that when you are planning a migration. But if your solution requires one of these components, well, Microsoft gives us the possibility of doing it with other Azure solutions, right? For example, we can always have a virtual machine, again, running analysis services, integration services, or reporting services. But if we focus specifically in analysis services, Microsoft also has a solution which is called Azure Analysis Services, which is same as the analysis services that we use on-premise, right? But in Azure as a service. So again, we connect to analysis services endpoint and we deploy our models. Something to consider that it's only support tabular models, not multidimensional models, right? For integration services, mainly to move and transform data, right? SSIS, well, Microsoft has this service called Azure Data Factory, which is trying to accomplish the same and in certain cases even more powerful than integration services. And for reporting services, well, we can consider using Power BI, right? So even if they are not coming, let's say, out of the box, Microsoft is providing us with the alternative also within Azure with other services, right? So why we should consider to migrate to managed instance? SQL Server, as we've been using it with CLR deployment, with SQL Server agents, with different installation levels, right? Compatibility with all the technologies, all the features that we've been using since we use SQL Server that are available over there, right? And the goal is, or the main advantage is that we won't need to worry about what is behind the scene, right? Something quite interesting is that how managed instance started and how we can see managed instance today, and later we will talk about the future, right? Initially, right, managed instance was only considered to be an extension of our on-premise infrastructure in Azure, right? So the connectivity from our, let's say, applications was only to the managed instance, and the managed instance per se had no connectivity outside our network, right? That was like an extension of our data center to Azure with private connectivity, meaning that there was absolutely no way to access a managed instance from internet or from public services, right? Then, of course, we were able, and we are still able, to host our application servers in Azure, and those application servers, which are internally connecting to the managed instance as a backend, and then serving directly to internet. That was possible. But for us to do the migration, to administer, to do the all the relationship between our on-premise infrastructure and managed instance, we had to do it with these private links. Initially, a VPN connection or express route. Right? That was the only way to do it. Then, upon, let's say, usage or user request, Microsoft gave us an alternative to have connectivity, public connectivity. We will check it in a minute. So
there's a question
yeah,
posted here. Docs, I think you might have addressed this briefly, but the question is, can we have horizontal scalability scale out in Azure SQL database?
If we can have what? Always on?
Horizontal scalability.
Horizontal. Okay. We
Scale
can,
out in.
yeah, we can scale up and down, giving more resources. And then horizontal scalability, if you're talking about having multiple read-write replicas, that is not possible today. There are other techniques to accomplish horizontal scalability that will depend more on your application, on how the application is written, right? But not, let's say, out of the box. That may change in the future. Microsoft has announced SQL Server 2022 with a certain, approach to accomplish horizontal scalability with a change that they made on the SQL replication, right? But not, let's say, out of the box. That will depend more on how you define your application, how you design your application. So some features that today are obsolete or there are a better alternative because of all the points that we've been discussing and the benefits of having managed instance, right? Always on availability groups, right? This is something that, again, we use a lot to accomplish high availability and disaster recovery for SQL Server or Azure SQL machines. Well, now it's coming as part of the service. All the different types of backups and restore, again, Microsoft behind the scenes is taking them for us. Windows authentication, as we know it, well, today we have the possibility of using Azure Active Directory as an alternative, right? So those are things that we can have changed. And, features that are completely retired are database mirroring, right? And extended store procedure. So at one point, I mentioned that managed instance is almost 100% compatible with SQL Server, right? And why is not 100% or is not the same? Well, first of all, there are few things that are not available in managed instance. I will say that the most important ones are the lack of file stream and file table features. That means in SQL Server, if we have a relational database to store files and then to access, those files directly from T-SQL, that is a feature available. I don't remember since which version, but it's available in SQL Server, which are not available on managed instance, right? So if your application is using one of these features when you use SQL Server, you may need to do a re-engineering of that part, right? There are alternatives, of course, right? But it's not a lift and shift process. You may have to rewrite some part of your application. For the others, is lift and shift, so the backup restore will allow you to do it. So if you want to, let's say, restore a database that has file stream, file table feature enabled, you won't be able to do it in managed instance, right? That may change, hopefully, in the future, right? Of course, for certain applications, this is a main blocker, right? So we are really looking forward to to have this change in the future. So how we identify a managed instance? Well, we will connect to a managed instance using the same tools that we've been using today, meaning Management Studio, Azure SQL Database, Visual Studio, you name it, right? It's the same. We will check it in few minutes, right? So some of the recent additions, and maybe these recent additions they are more, right? Is that Microsoft keep adding hardware generations, so improving the type of processors and type of infrastructure that we have under a managed instance, support for developer subscription. So if you have a developer subscription in Azure, you can deploy a managed instance. And now it support to be the backend of SharePoint, Dynamic 365, and also reporting services. All these services requires a SQL Server database to work, right? Well, now you can use a managed instance if you want to. At the very beginning, you were not able to change the time zone. So when you deploy a managed instance, it was only in the GMT, right? Now, when you deploy your managed instance, you will have you will be able to select and choose the time zone, right? What else? Let's move on. So we'll see it. If you use transparency data encryption (TDE), you are able actually now to bring your own key, your own certificate. You are also for this too. I have to remove preview because those are actually in general availability. You are able to do a geo-distribute failover groups, meaning that if you have a managed instance on an Azure region, for example, West Europe, and you want to have a geo-replicated instance in another region, you can have it, and under the hood, it will replicate automatically. You can configure the retention for your backups, right? So those are the latest features in managed instance. In terms of connectivity, remember that just before I told you that it was designed to have private connectivity within your data center with express route or VPN connectivity. Well, one of the latest features that Microsoft add is that alternative, or optionally, you can enable a public endpoint, so you can connect directly from internet to your managed instance. This you can enable by default, is still disabled. You can enable it if you want, right? Of course, it's not ideal, but if you have to, it is possible now. Then now you are able to define your time zone when you are deploying the managed instance. If your application requires a trace flag, managed instance support most of the trace flag, not all of them, because some of them they may not have sense, but the most important trace flags are supported also in managed instance, right? And this is something really great, actually, that was announced actually this week. I think that Gonzalo mentioned it just before. You are going to be able, actually, you are able to have in SQL Server 2019 with cumulative update 15, which is the most recent one, or with SQL Server 2022, which as for now, it is available in private preview, and you will be able to have what Microsoft called link feature for managed instance. That means your SQL Server databases, you will be able to set up an availability group with a wizard and have your database replicating to a managed instance. So this is going to be great if you want to, let's say, have a read-only replica of your on-premise workload running in Azure, but not in another SQL Server, but in a managed instance, so you can use it for multiple purposes, like, you know, be the source for reporting, for analytics, machine learning, etc. Really, really nice. For a managed instance, one thing that is extremely important is that you have integration with all the other Azure ecosystem, right? All the different types of applications that you have, applications and services that you have available in Azure, you know, can integrate a managed instance with absolutely no problem. It could be the source of analysis services, cube, Power BI reports, logic apps, Power Apps. So really, really interesting. Finally, we reach the point in where we will see all this in action, right? So let me jump here for a minute. Here I am in my Azure portal, right? Let's go to home, and I have here the, just start something so make it bigger. This is my Azure portal. I will go here to Azure SQL. Here I have all the resources that I have deployed, and here I have the option to create a new resource. Right? So I will go here and hit create, and this is our, let's say, initial landing zone to create Azure SQL services. Here at the right side, we have the possibility of setting up SQL Server virtual machines. As you can see, you know, you can choose which SQL Server version, edition, and which platform you want, right? Since 2008 R2 up to 2019, and as you can see, you also have Red Hat Windows, Red Hat 8, SUSE, Ubuntu. So you can just go here and choose the one you use. And now we will go here and choose Manage Instance. Right? So I'm going to start the process of creating a managed instance. And something that is really nice in Azure is that all the services that you deploy here, you know, the way of doing it is quite similar. Of course, each service requires its own specifics, but the look and feel is quite similar. So you choose your Azure subscription, the resource group, you know, a way to group your Azure services with the logical grouping. Then you have to specify a name for your managed instance. I will choose SQL MI 005. It will check if the name is available. Then you have to choose the region. Let's see, zoom it a little bit. You can choose the region in where you're going to have your managed instance. In my case, it's going to be East US. And then we have here what is called compute and storage, right? So when we go here I have the option of selecting the service tier, general purpose, or business critical. Right? Let's go with the general purpose. Here on the right side, you have a summary of the cost. It is expressed in Argentinian pesos, so you know it's just to consider. This is a recent update here in the hardware generation. You can choose the standard series, which is Gen 5, but you can also choose premium series, right? More, let's say, modern processors, which also support more memory per virtual core. So let's go with the standard Gen 5. And then here you can choose the amount of B cores that you want for your managed instance. And here the amount of storage that you want to say. Yeah.
Yeah, just conscious of time. We have another 5 minutes.
Yeah, we have. Yeah. So
yeah, 1 or 2 years.
Yeah, sure. So here you choose the amount of storage. If you already have SQL Server licenses because you have a contract with Microsoft, you can reuse them here. So we go apply. So we just select here the name, the region, the hardware and storage, and then we specify the authentication. I will set up SQL authentication to start with and do it easily. And we repeat it, it just check that it's all there. Then it will go to the networking part that, at the beginning, this was a complex task. Now it's going to take care of doing it automatically. As we said earlier, we have the public endpoint, right? So we can, let's say that we have access to internet directly. Then we go to security, not much to jump in here. Here we select the collation, right? If our database engine has a different collation than the default, we can choose it from here, and the time zone as well. Let's choose Buenos Aires. If we want to do shear replication, we just put yes, and we have to select if there are other managed instances that you want to replicate. In this case, we will put no. Maintenance window, we just leave the default. If we have tags for our deployment, the final step is a final review, right? So we have a summary of the cost of the, everything that you have, and then we hit create. Note something interesting here is that it's saying that deploying a managed instance is a long-running process and it can take up to 6 hours, right? So we won't create it from here because it's going to take 6 hours. So let's go to one that I have already created. So here we have one created before. So if here, for example, we go to compute and storage, we can change and scale, right? If we need more CPU, more storage, we can do it from here. Now that we have the managed instance, we go to an Azure SQL virtual machine that I have already deployed. I have, Management Studio, and I am connected to my managed instance from Management Studio. So here I also have, I still have 1 minute, yeah. Here I have my SQL Server 2019. I will take a database here. I will do a backup. I will send the backup directly to an URL, right? So if I go here, I connect to my subscription, and then when I choose my subscription, I will select my storage account, and I will do the backup directly to the storage account. Let's see if it is not having connectivity issues. No. Here I have my storage account. I select a container. I create a credential, and this is how it's going to be the backup file. So I do backup. Boom, done. Backup is done. Then I come to the managed instance, and it's as simple as do restore, right? I go here, restore from URL. Same step as before. I connect to my subscription. I choose the storage account, and you will see that it will restore right away. Let's jump to the last slides, so I don't pass the top of the hour. Well, that was a brief description of managed instance. If you want to learn more about managed instance, I leave you here this QR code, this URL. This will land you to the official Microsoft documentation from managed instance. This is a service that is constantly evolving. There's going to be a lot of news about this with more investment and really improving a lot. If you also want to go to the Azure Fundamentals webpage, You also have the QR code here, and we are done with the presentation. Thank you, everybody. I don't know if there are additional questions. Again, I leave you my contact information in this slide. So if you want to reach me for any further question, you are more than welcome.
Thank you so much, Javier.
Sure.
Yeah, it was a very fruitful sort of discussion, and the demo was really good to understand the nuances about the migration process, and then sort of moving from two different sort of places and creating backups. So yeah, it's been great. Thank you so much.